farmers, trust is everything. At Genesis Fertilizers, we're not just proposing to build a facility, we're building a future designed for you. With real progress already underway, we're closer to providing Western Canadian farmers with a reliable, locally produced fertilizer supply. Now is the time to take control of your farm's future. Learn more at genesisfertilizers.com/credibility.
The Agronomist is brought to you by the Pulse School, Wheat Pete's Word, and KWS Seeds. KWS Hybrid Rye is built for today's farmers, delivering high yields, forage versatility, and strong disease resistance. With early spring growth and reduced spraying, it offers easier management and a spread out workload. For grain or forage, KWS Hybrid Rye brings true value to your farm. Visit kws.com/ca to learn more. KWS, seeding the future since 1856. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith. And as you can hear, I'm a bit croaky today, but that's okay. I feel great. I just had way too much fun this weekend yelling over the live music. So, yeah, a little croaky, but that's okay. Welcome all. Kevin asked, is he the only one without snow? No, Kevin. Here in the Ottawa Valley, we have not yet had snow, and it is a month. A month till Christmas, everybody. That's your reminder. But we are supposed to get some freezing rain and perhaps some snow overnight. So, yes, it is coming, but some much needed moisture across Western Canada, of course, has hit over the last week. So, that is always good to see. Hi to Jason, Lilith. Mark is on as well. So, yes, from the combine still, hey? Getting that last of the crop in. All right. A quick reminder for everyone watching, if you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist. Let us know you took in the show and we will get those for you. Hello to Warren. He's joining as well. And Ray out of Calgary. Good to see everybody here. So thanks so much for joining us. And a quick reminder, if you head over or when you are there getting your CEU credits, there's also a little window where you can fill in your info and we will zip you an email to remind you of the topic and the day that we go live here Mondays on the Agronomist. So check that out, sign up for it. It'll remind you of things and send the link after as well. So that is all good. All right. So tonight's conversation, we are going to talk about crop rotation, and we're going to talk about the value of it and some of the really cool research results we've got on long-term rotation studies as well. So without further ado, let's bring in our guests. I've got Dr. Dave Hooker from the University of Guelph, Ridgetown campus, and Lana Shaw with the Southeast Research Farm out of Saskatchewan. Welcome here, both of you. Dr. Dave, how are things way down in Ridgetown? It's far.
Way down, way down.
Way down.
Yeah, everything is going just great. This is actually the last week of the teaching semester and then the final exams. And so I'm sensing a little bit of tension, a little bit of stress amongst the student population. And but I'm there to make it easier on them. I tell them, if they've studied hard, if they work hard, they will ace the final exam.
Mm-hmm. Are you a fun prof? Because I feel like you're a very fun prof.
Well, I try to be. I have lots of fun teaching.
Okay.
And I like to tell some jokes and some puns once in a while and try to mix it up. And but I'm not sure whether they're laughing with me or at me. And sometimes I have to clarify.
Yeah, that's right. All right. And Lana joining us, of course, from Saskatchewan. Lana, are you under all that snow? I've been seeing some fantastic pictures of that white, slow release moisture, as they say.
We haven't been hit as hard as some other areas, but we do have a blanket of snow. I don't think that it barely even froze before it had snowed. The ground hadn't frozen. So, and this is the first cold day we've actually really had where it was -20.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it is actually quite cold. Yes, absolutely. And let's dig into some of the things that now, Dave, I know that you teach as well, but we are going to talk tonight about the long-term rotational studies that you work on. And Lana, of course, at the Southeast Research Farm, plenty of projects on the go there as well. Um, Lana, just catch us up from this season at least. What were some of the highlights of the work that you're doing there at the research farm?
Okay. Well, one of the big new ones that we're doing is I'd applied for a grant with Yvonne Lawley and Luke Struckman to do a cover crop study with the FFAR Ag Mission out of the US. And we were successful in getting that. It started over a year ago. And so we're looking at integrating cover crops and or strategies around integrating cover crops in the southern parts of the prairies and the more moist southern parts of the prairies, thinking that if it does fit on this landscape, it may not be on every acre. It might only be certain points of the landscape, and
Okay.
maybe it is coming in more as a prescription map for a cover crop rather than a blanket application. So,
Okay.
and then looking at, do we think about the entomology implications of cover crops? Could this help
Mm,
with making some of the crops a little more resilient, improving stands in some of those low-lying areas where typically the
okay.
field mortality is quite high? So trying to find where can the cover crops actually be an advantage, and maybe we just put it in those places, but actually trying to quantify that. And we've got a fair bit of resources to try to address that. And it also covers some on-farm trials and co-development or co-design with the farmers so they can help us come up with some strategies.
Very cool. Okay. I love hearing about all the cool stuff that's going on. Now, Dr. Dave Hooker has, of course, the long-term rotational studies that we're going to talk about tonight for sure. But what else have you got going on there in the summer to keep you busy?
Well, being an agronomist, I've got my hand in a lot of different research projects, and Lana touched on a very important part, and that is collaboration with other specialists. And so I work closely with my good friend Albert Tenuta, especially on tar spot and gibberella. Those are the top two in corn issues, and Dr. Jocelyn Smith on the insect side, and my colleagues on the main campus in cropping systems, Dr. Josh Nazilski and Adrian Crendo. And I just love working with them. They certainly add to all of my research projects, and hopefully I add a little bit to theirs as well. So it's a very good collaborative effort. I just love that.
Now, and for those who maybe aren't aware, if you're out in Western Canada or down in the States, Ridgetown campus, of course, and Guelph campus, quite far. Yes, we'll call them both Southern Ontario, but there is a huge difference. And Lana, of course, the research farm that you're at is one of several in Saskatchewan. How many different research farms similar to yours are there in Saskatchewan, and do you work together as well, similar but different maybe than how the university would?
So there's a network of 8 nonprofit research farms that are supported by the provincial government but independent from it. And we work very often together on group projects, and it will just depend on which locations those projects are most relevant for, or if it appeals to those local areas.
Okay. Yep. So 8 different ones in the province. And it is, I mean, Ontario has a very large growing region, but when you look at Saskatchewan and you look just north south, just how far of a difference it is, it's quite remarkable how much of a growing area there is. Alberta, of course, even more so. So it's I can imagine there needs to be that many to get to capture all the differences between them. Now, Ray's got a good follow-up question, Lana, to talk about variable cover cropping. And so thinking about it, are there ideas? It's early, he says, yes, but are there ideas on acre size that might make variable cover cropping uh, perhaps more manageable? Is there sort of a base that you'll be looking at as far as how big of a field or how small of a field it actually might be useful for?
I think it makes a difference what technology people have for doing
Mm,
the seeding, if they've got sectional control
yeah.
or what they're able to do. But they can have prescription maps made for all kinds of other things, so they can have a prescription map potentially made for a cover crop, and target it into those more moist zones. In our geography, I think that makes quite a bit of sense. It's competing with weeds. It's tying up nitrates when they probably should be tied up in some of those zones. So that's one of the possibilities. Possibly on some knolls, it would do some good
Right.
at times, but we're not sure. That's why we
Mhm.
have to do the trials to try to see where they're being successful, or if they're taking away from the subsequent crop in certain
Right.
areas, we'll be able to document that.
Now
Good,
that
good
that
stuff.
actually, yeah, Dave, that dovetails well into a lot of the work that you're doing, and one of the big questions that's certainly here in Ontario, we don't usually typically lack for moisture. However, there still are some pretty major questions about yield drag, maybe, or some of these questions when it comes to cover crops. Um, we do have work that's looking to address some of that, but how do you feel some of those questions that look at our cover crops potentially taking away from the following crop if we don't manage for it?
Yeah, I guess that question was directed at me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Just to make sure. So I've always said that cropping a crop management plan should not be a recipe that's decided months or a year in advance. It needs to be flexible according to the hand that Mother Nature provides and dishes out. And there's a lot of factors that go into a decision, and I think growers need to be like I should have a list of options available just at a moment's notice. Change in plans. As it gets drier out, or it's warmer than normal, cooler than normal. Like plans should be flexible.
hmm and goodness, do we ever have to be at times? And then, of course,
Hmm.
there's a season like this one where it started out kind of poor and ended off amazing.
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah,
that.
that's right.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So
and
hey,
and that and,
yeah.
and that story really leads well into crop rotation, actually, because when
hmm
we talk about resilience against
Yes.
stresses, crop rotations fit
Yeah.
that bill. Yeah.
Okay. Farmer Jim is joining us from snowy southwestern Saskatchewan. He doesn't get to say that much, everybody. So let's give him a high five for that one. It doesn't snow a lot where Farmer Jim is. Mark's got a good question. Are there any? And so maybe we'll get into some of the slides that you've got, Dave, as we look into this. Are there any long term crop rotation studies being done that include manure in the rotation? Because I know we look at different tillage, I know we look at different fertility rates. Um, I'll put this to both of you. Dr. Dave, what do we have in Ontario? Are there any long term that include manure in the study?
Yeah, so I am not aware of any long-term research that looks at manure. A lot of experiments, when manure is a factor, quite often the application of the manure tends to be quite variable. It's not as uniform as we want. And to be honest, the data stinks, from that
Oh,
setup. Okay, did
that
you
was
get
a
that there? Yeah.
pun,
Yeah.
Dave. Okay, I got it. Okay. It stinks because it's
Yeah.
variable. It's a variable
Yeah, that's
input,
right. Yeah,
but it's also
seriously.
applied.
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
Lana, I mean, I'm aware of some work in Manitoba that certainly Don Flayton and his team would have done in Manitoba that really showed that you kind of have to do long term for manure because it has such a long term impact. Are you
Right.
aware of any off the top of your head in Saskatchewan that is looking
I,
longer term?
I don't I don't know of any long-term manure trials. I know the U of S has
Yeah.
done manure work over the years, but I don't know if those are 4-year or 6-year trials, or if any of them could be classified as long-term.
Yeah. It is, Mark, to that point, like, that is one of the challenges with trying to assess something like manure in the rotation is it has such a long tail, right? It's that legacy. So Don Flayton was on this show a couple of years ago and talked about they did measure impacts of manure application, you know, like decades later. Like you could see
Mhm.
the history of it in it, but it is a tough variable to manage for.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
yeah. So Mark, maybe you need to start some of your own trials. Why not? We'll just make work for people. Okay, so let's dig into some of Dave. You mentioned the resiliency piece, so let's talk about that maybe first. And if we've got data to back it up, great. The question of the why of rotation often comes in, right? And someone will say, oh, because yields are better. And yes, we often talk in yields, but what else does crop rotation do, or what actually supports that yield? That I think is one of the things we're
Yeah.
trying to get to. So Dave, take us away on that one, on the resiliency piece.
Yeah, maybe we can show us that slide two, please.
Okay. Producer Jay,
Yeah,
if you will. Slide 2. We'll start there.
so these rotation trials have been going on for a long time. So long-term trials have distinct advantages over short-term trials, and long-term we want to see, long-term effects. So cropping systems tend to change gradually over time, and quite often it takes about 15 years for a system to equilibrate once a significant management factor changes, like crop rotation or tillage. And so there's two good trials. I manage one at Ridgetown, and the other one, a sister site, is managed at Alora, and we tend to apply for both, like, funding together. And the Alora site is managed by my colleague, Dr. Adrian Correndo, and he's just a new faculty member on the main campus. But this slide is just a kind of highlights. It highlights the outputs, the significant outputs from these trials, and it's not meant to be seen or to be read like these little squares or images, right? Yeah. But you can follow the QR code, and we have some info sheets posted on the university server, and you can dig into some of the results, such as yield effects of adding wheat to the rotation. Like, what impacts does that have on corn and soybean yields, and on the soil quality, the resilience against stresses. And we can show that data a little bit later if you like. But that resilience against stresses, I think that is the most interesting one to me.
Okay. Lana, when you're thinking about, and you do a lot of intercropping work as well, so you are using very complicated rotation, sometimes multiple species in a year, etc., and trying to gauge some of the impacts and those sorts of things. What are some of the observations and some of the work that you do on the Southeast Research Farm that is looking at this potential of resiliency when it comes to having complex rotations, not complicated, complex?
I think one of the things that I've found talking to farmers is on an economic aspect. They'll look at, what can I sell this particular crop for, and what yield do I typically get versus the next one, but they really are not well able to quantify what effect a pea crop is having on the wheat crop that comes after it, or a canola crop that's coming after wheat, or those differences in profitability. And it could make it be a difference in that there's less disease pressure or less insect pressure, that they're required less to spray for certain with certain pesticides. And that was a really hard thing when we were doing rotational trials, is we were trying to treat everything pretty much the same. Once in a while we'd have to go spray for flea beetles or something, but we couldn't, in those small plots, really control for some of those things that were you would have some larger scale impacts. But I don't think we can really underestimate the effect of those long-term rotations on having a more stable agriculture system that doesn't require us to be intervening all the time. I've likened this to a two-legged stool when people are growing 2-year crop rotations. And they're sitting on a two-legged stool asking us to help them sit on a two-legged stool. And I just say, you need more legs under your stool. It needs to be 3 or 4 in order to be more stable. And and it's not my job to help you to sit. It shouldn't be my job to help you sit on a two-legged stool. It's our job to help put another leg under it.
Mm-hmm.
It's an excellent analogy. Yes, I'd rather sit on a 3 or a 4 than balance on a 2. Sometimes it works, right? And sometimes you fall. So there you go. Now, Dave, I think Lana's explained it well, that when you are doing plot research, you do try to control for the variables. And so how difficult is it to tease out the rotational effect when you're looking at this data versus other
Yeah.
impacts potentially?
Yeah. Well, these long-term trials, they really require a team, an administrative team, to make the best decisions, because if a change is made, we have to really stick with that change, with a particular practice for a long time, or else we're not sure what is affecting, the system or the trends. So that's kind of the most difficult part of these long-term trials, is they have to be set up correctly and make a hard decision. And really, we can't make any significant changes for, a number of years. But if something isn't working out in terms, like a particular tillage practice or something like that, I am a strong believer in making that change and not going any further with it. Something that does not work. These long-term trials, they're replicated. So we have 4 replicates, and each crop phase, let's say in a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, those phases are repeated across the trial. So that rotation is represented in every crop phase every year. So we have, like in a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, we have corn in that corn, soybean, wheat rotation. We have soybean right beside it in another corn, soybean, wheat rotation that's offset, in that phase. And so it gets really complicated in a hurry. But with that, we can answer a lot of questions too.
Right. That, and which is a key part of that. So, so Kevin offers that UBC Agassiz would have some info talking about manure rotation, and Scott Gillespie says that Frank Larney did a lot of work with manure on irrigated long-term trials, and I believe Bart Lardner at in Saskatchewan has done some as well. So that may help. Scott wanted to know if there are any similar resources like the ones you shared, Dave, for the prairies. If Lana is aware, other ones. One of the challenges, Scott, is that realistically there are very few long-term trials, and we're talking very long-term. There is, I want to say, Guy Lafont was probably one of the reasons we even have any in Saskatchewan, and Manitoba does have some long-term trials as well. Don Flayton was a big part of those. Mario Tenuta is part of those as well. So they're there, but like to that point, the long-term part of a trial is the hard part.
Yes.
Very much, right? In getting past a 4-year funding window or a 3-year funding window. And that's why we don't have a ton of them. Yeah. Now in the UK, we also have very, very long-term trials. And those are fascinating too. And we can look at some of that as well. We're just going to quickly, Producer Jay, if you would, let's send a shout out to one of our show sponsors, and then we'll come back to our discussion right after that. Our sponsors for The Agronomists are Wheat Pete's Word, KWS Seeds, and the Pulse School. From pulse seed quality and selection to made in Canada varietal development and on to disease management and marketing decisions, the Pulse School keeps farmers in the loop on pulse production. The Pulse School is made possible by support from BASF. Learn more at pulseschool.com. All right. Now, Dave, I have a question. Because you used a word, and I think I know what it means, but I think it's important. And it's not equilibrium, but it's sort of equilibrium. But it's this idea, because sometimes this gets challenged sometimes in trials, is that if you're going to change a practice, you have to do it for a long time. And we see this in cover crops. We see this in that yield drag or whatever the case may be, or manure use. You have to do it long enough for your soil to basically sort of adapt to that being the new normal. So explain that to me.
Yeah, some of the changes that we can make in a cropping system can be major, like a crop sequence change or a tillage tillage plays or has a big impact on a cropping system. So if a system is used to conventional intensive tillage and then we switch to no-till, it will take a number of years, and research has shown 10, 15 years for that new system to equilibrate to that no-till system. And this is kind of the power of these long-term trials, or the importance of them, because if a farmer wants to make one of these decisions, those benefits, any benefit might not be realized for a number of years. And so we can, access some of these data points in a long-term trial to answer some of these long-term questions. So if we make a change now, we might not see any effect for another 10 years or so. But if we make it now, that means we will see them in 10 years, rather than waiting and waiting and waiting, and it's too late, we retire, and it's up to the to the next caretaker of the land. So these trials are very important, I think.
So Lana, along that line of thinking, when you make a change, sometimes you see some positive output relatively quickly, and that's great. But sometimes you don't see the, immediate impact in, let's say, a 3-year or a 4-year trial. You might get some good data that, you can make some good decisions with. But in thinking about, going from a 2-legged stool to a 3 or a 4, how do you, what sort of research and what data do you bring forward for farmers to show them that, yes, maybe in the short term, it might be a little uncomfortable because you're getting away from maybe some of what you figure are your big money makers. But that longer term, it's going to have these overall positive impacts potentially.
Yeah, I think where we saw it in our we did a trial for 5 years, and we were doing some cover crop things, but we had a 2-year wheat canola rotation in there, and then a 4-year rotation without cover crops, and a 4-year rotation with cover crops. And we were definitely noticing we were having weed problems in the wheat canola that we weren't in the other 4-year crop rotation. It enables a lot of different herbicides to be used. There's breakdown of residues. There's just differences in pest pressure that you're going to have. And we were even getting it in these small plot areas. Even though the flea beetles can move around, they were still always hitting those short rotation plots first.
Interesting. And so even in a 5-year or even a 4-year where you have a diverse rotation versus an alternation, you could see impacts that quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. Yes, Dave. Down in front.
I have a question for Lana. I know, Lana, you are the leader, I think, in Canada of intercropping. And my question for you is, how does intercropping and crop rotation, there's must be a very huge interplay between the two. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure how you would understand, a crop sequence, crop rotation, and then when you mix intercropping in with that, could you maybe describe some of that complexity?
Sure. Are we trying to square the circle? Maybe. I think people tend to say, well, that means you're just going to grow the same crops, but with more frequency. And I always just say, no, it means we're adding in more grains for sale in total. That we could be putting flax into an area where they typically wouldn't grow flax, or oats in an area where they typically wouldn't grow oats, or peas in an area where they typically wouldn't grow peas. So, and what I've said for a long time is that we are applying the same ideas of crop rotation, but with more complexity. So you would space out each individual component in time. That's one of the main things about crop rotations that work, is that we might only grow an individual crop once every 4 years so that the pests don't have a big chance to multiply and establish very thoroughly. So those same ideas apply to a more complex crop rotation. So it's something to keep in mind when people are seeding clovers, or if they're intercropping a lot, that you could be building up root rots, or you could be, if you're using a lot of brassicas, in the multi-species cover crop if you have a lot of brassicas and then you're growing canola in your rotation. That is something to be aware of. That still counts as a brassica that will be relevant for your pests, for your flea beetles. Flea beetles love radishes. All of those things still are based in reality. It's just that the reality got more complex.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and Kevin's got a good point here. Now Kevin's in the Fraser Valley. Land is too expensive, in too high demand, and too many animals to feed to experience yield drag to be feasible. And this is why I think, Kevin, that's an excellent point as to why we have research that gets done on research farms, so that we have some guidance as to what is going to work on a farm at a field level and not be a wreck. We do it at the
Yeah.
plot level so that we don't have wrecks out there. Yes, 150 to 200,000 per acre, where Kevin is. I can't
Wow.
even imagine. Yeah, it's wild.
That's a
Go ahead,
lot
Lana.
of money.
Yes.
And it's, yes, we want to try to figure out how to avoid yield drag, but that's really expensive land to have your soil end up in the Fraser River or wherever it is you are. So there's that the value of that land is it with what it is, it's also important to keep it in place and
Hmm.
to keep that that productivity up because the protecting the soil is one of the ways we do that.
Mm-hmm. Which and Kevin, I think, shared earlier where he's putting manure in rotation. They have back to back to back crops, right? They make very good use of the fall and the spring, and to always have something growing there to be using all of those great nutrients from all the manure that they have to spread, and that amazing growing season that they have there, which is amazing. So, I mean, but that is part of the point of these rotations. Isn't just about yield. Also, it's about exactly that weed control or suppression, about spreading out potentially, our erosion risk and trying to minimize that, and those sorts of things as well. So, okay, so Scott's got a good question on the intercropping question with disease buildup. If you did a chickpea flax every 2 years, you'd build up disease faster than each individually ever 4 with cereals in between. What do you think, Lana?
Yeah.
Would you or would you not?
Yeah, I wouldn't suggest anybody grow chickpeas every 2 years.
No.
Could you get away with it? I don't know, but you can start your own long-term trials to find out. I think you'd be putting some other kind of you could put a pea in there instead of a chickpea flax on the third year. So um, it would be the same thing if like that's why I'm saying we can still space it out in time. You don't have to grow that one broadleaf crop too frequently. And
Yeah.
what tends to happen is the chickpea price goes up, people put in a bunch of chickpea flax, and then the price goes down and they wait it out for a few years.
Hmm. Flax is also one that sees a birthday in the bin sometimes. So there's that too. Okay, let's look at Dr. Dave's got some great slides here of looking at some of these results. And so where do you want to start, Dave? Because I think
Yes.
let's put some numbers to
So,
some of this theory.
yes. How about slide 3?
Slide 3, producer Jay. There we go.
Yeah,
Okay.
I
So,
know everyone in Ontario is just sick of this slide because I show it just about every crop rotation presentation.
you should put it on a shirt.
I've shown this. That's right.
Yeah,
It
there.
should be it's like my wallpaper on my
Yeah,
computer or something
it
like
should
that.
be.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
that prominent. But we talk about, I guess, the stress about these long-term rotations. The bottom line is that we should not be thinking and enter each enterprise, crop enterprise, as if they behave independently in a cropping system, because there's a lot of dependencies. There's not only crop diversity and complexity, but there's crop sequence. There's what species affects another species in rotation. And in this case, we look at wheat. And so a lot of the studies and work that we do, we look at wheat in rotation with corn and soybeans. And in the plowed system and in the no-till system, we have the wheat giving between 6 and 17 more bushel of corn in an otherwise corn soybean rotation. So that plays well when farmers are trying to decide, should I grow wheat or not? My expected yield is this. my expected wheat price, is that, that's only part of the piece, like just a very small piece of the puzzle. The other piece is what impact does wheat have on corn and soybean. So slide 4 is soybean. So let's go to slide 4. And slide 4 shows soybean yield increases by 5 bushel per acre in a corn, soybean, wheat rotation versus a corn, soybean rotation. So you could just think of the economics here in a corn, soybean, wheat rotation versus a corn, soybean rotation and what the wheat brings. And this has been the story for a good number of years, but it just underlines the effect of the rotation effect, of other crops.
What is
wheat,
what's the big asterisk snowflake in the middle? Why is that there?
Yeah, that just means statistical significance.
Okay, that's your big snowflake.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, big snowflake.
Yeah.
The statistical significance between corn and soybean rotation and corn, soybean, wheat at 5 bushel is statistically significant.
Okay. Yeah. Now, one question here, and Lana, I'll go to you on this as well, because years ago I sat in on a discussion in Manitoba, because crop insurance in Manitoba actually has some decent data on the impact of growing a crop on a different crop stubble, right? So the rotation impact, that they have some good data from crop insurance on the rotation impact. And the discussion was, when you make your cropping budget, do you make it per crop or do you make it per rotation? So in my mind, Dave, like if you look at this, you could make a cropping budget and it would have to be 3 years or 2 years, depending on if you were corn soy or corn soy wheat or back-to-back soybeans, whatever, and compare them. Lana, do you think if I suggested that to the farmers in your area that anyone would do it? Would they do a 4-year cropping budget and actually work it out on those 4 or no?
I'd be curious to know if some of the agronomists that are helping to work with farmers that help them work through the economics of this, if they do that, because I don't think we've really got the calculators built that I know of that will say, okay, if you've got this rotation, then you need to, you're assuming that you're bumping up your yield. All you would have would be your historical yields, based on what your crop rotation that you've done in the past. But then that's so variable based on the weather that it's hard for you to use that to predict that, well, usually I get 15% more yield following with a wheat that comes after peas, or we know there's some of those rotational benefits. There's non-nitrogen and nitrogen benefits to growing after a pulse crop. So it's not just the nitrogen benefit. There are other benefits. There's mycorrhizal fungi benefits. There's a lot of things that there's moisture effects with some of the later harvested crops. I think sometimes we see a yield lag with them because they're using moisture through later in the season.
Right. Or rooting depth. Yeah.
Or rooting depth. Yeah. So I don't think we've got great tools really built for helping farmers or agronomists to really understand this complexity around the economics.
Yeah. So and Dave, that Lana, it's a great point, because I think we're pretty good, especially like, let's talk red clover here in Ontario, or looking at a pea crop in the West. We're pretty good about that nitrogen credit, right? We talk a lot about, how much of a credit do I give when we're making those fertilizer decisions? But that's really only, and here we go, Dave, scratching the surface of the impacts of a rotation. You're right, Lana, there's non nitrogen and also nitrogen. So Jeanette offers, and Dave, I'll go to you on this one. Jeanette Gauthier, whose dog also stepped on the phone. So if her dog typed this, he's a genius. Saying we need the opposite data, saying the value of soybeans on wheat and canola. Is it a similar response? So I guess that's a really good question, Jeanette. Is it adding a third crop in rotation, or is it wheat specifically that does something amazing? Dave, can we answer that question?
Yeah, well, I can't answer that specific question because I don't have canola, right? We don't have that specific rotation. to
Right.
test out in our long-term trials. And so maybe that would be a better one for Lana. I'm not sure. But these different crop sequences are just as important, and the crop species just as important as the actual crop rotation and complexity and diversity. And so a lot of times I think we get caught up in complexity and diversity, and we don't look at, or we miss the opportunities what a crop species brings to the rotation. And in terms of a corn soybean rotation, wheat brings a lot to the table. And so wheat may be a detractor in some other crop rotations, maybe in the prairies and in other environments. And so I think Lana would be a better person with more experience in prairie in the prairie type treatments.
So our southeast Saskatchewan region and into Manitoba grows a lot of soybeans, and I'm seeing a lot of dirt blowing on these soybean and canola and wheat 3-year rotations, frankly. I don't think in that case that we're having enough cereals, having enough fibrous roots, having enough residue to really keep a resilient system. It's nice as a cleanup crop sometimes, and I think that is true for in general for pulses in and the broadleafs in rotation, is that they need to be alternating or fitting in with rotations that have cereals, that have things that have a lot of fibrous roots, a lot of straw, a lot of material, of more robust material, or material that has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, so that you have that soil protection going over, building up over a year or two. Because once you get your soil healthier, that residue starts to turn over faster. Some of the intercroppers and the soil health people get building up their soil biology enough that the turnover starts to be rapid, and then they're trying to grow they're growing cereals every other year and trying to have even taller stubble to protect their soil. So I think it's something to, it's not just the spacing out crops in time. It's also the quality of that residue, mycorrhizal fungi, and then what herbicides are you able to use? Can you put something in that rotation that interrupts weed cycles? I was kind of amazed. I was down in Corpus Christi at the on a Tri Societies tour this month, and they were growing cotton and sorghum down there on 30-inch or 40-inch row spacing, and they have 0.7% organic matter,
Yeesh.
and it's kind of a shocking thing. And they don't feel like there's really any other good options. So I come back here and go, wow, we have a lot of options here. We have
Yes.
so many things that we can sell, that we can grow. We grow about 20 different species of grain crops on our research farm in a given year. And that blows people's minds that there's even a location where you can
Where you
actually
can.
grow that many crops. We are
Yeah.
fortunate that way. We are in Canada, we are rather fortunate to have the genetic resources, the crop trials, the development on this abundance of different crops that are possible to grow and
Mhm.
sell.
And sell. And that's a key point, right? It has to be profitable. There has to be a market for it, but we haven't. So two things. I did pull clips for this episode, but we're rapidly running out of time, which I was afraid we would do. We still have so much to cover. So I don't want to go. I do want to talk about what Kevin's brought up in the chat though as well, and Mark. But I wanted just to sort of put a point on this. That question about, you know, that rotation, Dave, that you're looking at, that is specifically corn, soy, wheat. And Lana, you're looking at, potentially intercropping with cover cropping and canola, wheat, soybean, et cetera. It does matter which species we're putting in. It's not just that sliding in a third or a fourth or a fifth does magical things.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it does matter. So that builds on Mark's point or his question. Dave, is it wheat specific, or would any cereal fit in that 3-year corn, soy, wheat rotation? Great question, Mark. So Dave, where do
Yeah.
we go with that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's a question we get asked a lot. And we don't have other small grain cereals in our rotation
Right.
systems, both at Elora and Ridgetown, because we're just limited in how many treatment combinations we have. But winter wheat, like we plant it in the fall, it grows in the fall, stays green over winter. It'll slow down, of course, in December, January, and February. Usually it does. But as soon as the weather starts up, it starts growing again. So it stays green. Winter cereals stay green for a long time. Roots are exuding sugars into the soil profile, feeding microorganisms. And that turnover and that fibrous root system, all that green mass that is actively growing, that is, I think, the key to the response of other crops to wheat in rotation. And I think that spring grain cereals would be important, but maybe not as quite as effective as
Right.
the winter small grains.
So it potentially, and obviously your rotation trial, and again, a long-term rotation trial, you can't just swap something out because then
Right.
it's not really the same rotation trial. But to that end, then it could be a fall rye if that someone might want to experience with, or a winter barley or winter triticale or something
Yeah.
like that. But to that end, in that rotation that you're looking at, Dave, it is a fall seeded cereal, so that you've got
Yes.
that ground cover and you've got
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah.
that's key. Jason Vogt out of Manitoba shares, who was on last week. Hi, Jason. Wheat on soybeans, he's seen a benefit. Canola on soybeans, stubble, a benefit. But soybeans on canola, not so much from what he's seen. So sounds to me like someone needs to do some trials. Jason and
Yeah.
Jeanette, get together.
But
You guys
but
talk.
that
Yeah,
that highlights the crop sequence there. So it's
that's
not
right. Yeah,
necessarily the species
yeah.
or the rotation. That's a sequence effect.
Sequence.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
So yeah, so do more of it. I love it. Okay. Producer Jay, if you would, let's go to our last read of the night. And then we'll come back to our conversation in just a moment. The Agronomist is brought to you by KWS Seeds, the Paul School, and Wheat Beats Word. Every Wednesday, Peter Wheat Pete Johnson answers your top agronomy questions in this dynamic podcast, covering planting, herbicides, soil health, cover crops, and so much more. Have a question? Leave him a message at 1-888-746-3311 or email him at petejohnson@realagriculture.com. Yes, please do. Every Wednesday. Check it out. Okay. Okay. We've got, for our last part of this conversation as well, just to build on some of this, I want to tackle Kevin's observation. And so one of the clips I pulled was a canola school talking about, because sometimes, let's face it, sometimes in the spring weather, whatever it may be, maybe it was the fall season before, whatever rotation you had selected, as you said, Dave, you got to be quick on your feet. Sometimes things change, and you have to change things out. But changing something out changes a lot, and it could be some of those benefits that you've accrued through a healthy rotation. If you tighten up those rotations, you could be giving up some other things, like different weeds might get ahead of you. You may not have the herbicide options you would like. You may have put down fertilizer that's not going to get used, or whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of things that you're planning for the next year. But this is Kevin's observation, and I think this is a great way to sort of bring this rotation impact discussion together, saying that it's not just about yields. I don't think people realize how important crop rotations are to fight against disease, weeds, and insect pests, which we've talked about for sure. As an industry, we need to think about how we're using or misusing our pesticide tools and the effects of overuse of chemistries until they don't work anymore. Kevin, a fantastic sort of synopsis of a lot of what we are challenged by. Absolutely. I love it. Okay, Dave, I'll go to you first. Sort of in this, obviously you're measuring yield through these rotation trials. What are some of the other observations? What are some of the other things that you are measuring through these long-term trials?
Yeah, well, standard practice on the cropping side for crop measurements, we take plant populations, any insect or disease issues, observations, incident severity, those kinds of things, so we can document those trends. and measure them. And so tar spot was one of them. Is a major disease, new disease in corn in Ontario. And one of the questions was, can we control tar spot with either tillage or crop rotation? And so Albert and I, we take measurements in these crop rotation trials, in this long-term crop rotation trial, to try to answer some of those questions. And then we do just a standard practice quality assessments as well. We take 1,000 seed weight to try and look at, some of the yield components. If yield is increasing on some treatment, we want to see which yield component is causing that increase in yield, and then we can determine maybe some what part or what phase of the crop is that stress being alleviated, in the crop development cycle. And then we take 1,000 seed weight. We take quality analysis, protein, oil, and starch. And some years we do mycotoxin analysis.
Right.
And then there's a whole suite of soil analysis that we do as well. So I work closely with my colleague, Dr. Laura Vineyard, and at Ridgetown as well. And there are various soil experts on the main campus. And most recently, Carrie Dunfield, and she's been on the show before, Dr. Carrie Dunfield, and she is a soil microbiologist, and she has a grad student looking at microbe communities in these rotation systems as well, and just awesome, just results and effects. I wish we had, another show to talk about the microbial effects, but yeah, lots of different questions can be answered.
Yeah. This show goes every Monday, Dave. I have a whole season to fill all winter. So,
all right, I'll send you a list.
Yeah, send me a list of all your things. But yes, but that we have had that conversation on the show and will again as to the change in the crop choices that you make. So what gets planted, what gets seeded has an impact, of course, on those microbial populations. So yes, we observe the above ground changes in disease or changes in insect populations, but there's all sorts of things that are happening below ground too. And
Right.
Lana, you've talked about that, either fibrous root systems or rooting depths, or the relationships with the fungi populations, all those things. So in thinking about Kevin's comment about the rotation impact being more than just yield, certainly you're dealing with very complex rotations and multiple crops even in a single year. How do you try to quantify what some of those benefits are when it comes to either weed suppression or insect pests or disease questions?
We haven't had really any long-term trials, or very, very few attempts at rotational trials where we're looking at cover crops or especially intercropping. I had one trial where we managed to look, that was with Dr. Kui Lu, where we looked at the effect on the subsequent wheat crop of either just growing peas or oats or pea oats. What's the effect on the subsequent wheat crop? I'm not sure what those results have come out and said yet, but it's very hard to get those kind of long-term, all read high budget grants for doing that kind of work. Either that, or you have to be at a station where they will, like an Agriculture Canada station or a university station, where they'll just support it as part of their
Ongoing.
long-term objectives.
I to Kevin's point, I think I think very much about canola when I think about some of the incredible disease and pest challenges that crop has. And there are definitely areas where 1 in 3 is the closest really that you should be growing it. It's that still gets pushed. And then we have something like Aphanomyces where with our pulse crops that they're saying 1 in 8, maybe 1 in 10. And even then, if the conditions are really good 8 years out, that crop might still end up with an Aphanomyces root rot. Like that's hard.
It is. And I think sometimes they're figuring out, well, the last time I grew a crop on this land and if it was a wet year, then that one that field, you might be leaving a very long time. Whereas other
Right.
ones where the last time I grew peas on there, it was dry, maybe you can come back maybe there a little more quickly. So the rotations end up being very flexible. But that's one of the reasons for trying to have more than one pulse in a rather long crop rotation. If people are only growing lentils every 6 or 8 years, either they need to put in a different pulse, or they're just going to end up dropping pulses for
Entirely. Yeah.
spans of years because they don't. It's just not. It becomes logistically not very sensible.
I talked to one farmer on the Farm Rapid Fire last week or the week before who is sort of at the point of potentially dropping lentils entirely from the rotation because of Aphanomyces impacts. And it does, just like adding a crop into the rotation sets off a chain of events, so does taking something out. Right. And so there's, there's the impact on the weed spectrum. There's the impact on potentially for them. They like lentils because they could harvest early. So it was harvest management that they have to try and account for, right? So what else can they grow that would be early to get the combine rolling early so they can manage their time? So maybe it's barley, but that's not a pulse; it's a cereal, right? So there's so many of these things that come into that mix for sure. Now, Dave, one of the as Lana's pointed out, the West wins when it comes to cropping options. Ontario has lots of options too. It's just they have to do well, and you have to have somewhere to sell them, and then you have to have the equipment to do it, etc. So I love that we have worked with a 3 crop in rotation. Is it diverse enough? Do you need to be adding more in there, like say cover crops after the wheat comes off? Would that be the next step in your 3 crop rotation, or what would that look like? Maybe.
Yes. Yeah, we have some other long-term experiments that have more of a cover crop focus. On these long-term trials that we presented tonight, we have red clover with and without red clover, wheat underseeded with red clover, and so those with wheat in the rotation, we can add a cover crop quite easily. And with a corn soybean rotation, we're quite restricted, in cover crop options. But we have another experiment looking at long-term effects, different cover crop intensities, after wheat or in a couple rotations. And so that's generating some good results as well.
And there is some research going on having those cover crops grazed off versus burned off. On the other pulse question, Jason shares dry beans, baby. I know some farmers that love them, Jason, and other ones that do not. So edible beans are not everyone's favorite. There's an insect bugging me, trying to get away from the rain, maybe. Yes. Okay. So, I think we have established. So to me, a successful episode of The Agronomist means that we have probably come up with at least one master's or PhD project. And so I think that we've done that. We need Jeanette and Jason to team up and do perhaps some long-term trials of putting soybean in the rotation in Manitoba. And I think we need, by province, I think it would be great to have more of that data of quantifying the rotational impacts of choosing your next crop and being able to do budgets. Go ahead, Lana.
I think we can generate some more of that data and come out with it more of like you mentioned before, the crop insurance data. That's a treasure trove of statistical information that could help us make smarter decisions overall and be, and maybe there could be some individualized things that could be developed from that based on people's cropping history, but I don't know how that looks. There's of course, decisions that are made at various levels for what is the purpose of this whole data set. I think it's an untapped resource for agronomic information.
I agree. I'll make some phone calls, Lana. I'll let you know what I can do. I don't think I'll be able to do anything, but I can try. Producer Jay, would you bring up, I think it's slide 4 or slide 5 of Dave's. I want to say it's slide 4. Maybe it's slide 5. But there's one more here that had some QR codes. So next one. So slide 5, I guess. I'm not good with math, guys. I'm good with words. Yes. So I wanted to, Dave, if you could speak to this one as well, because I think It is a fascinating topic. We obviously can't cover everything, and the complexity question I think is a really interesting one. So what will
Yeah.
people learn if they follow these QR codes?
Well, 4 or 5 years ago, the Elora site and the Ridgetown long-term site, we were invited by the USDA to be part of a much bigger meta-analysis or database that consists of 2 trials in Ontario, and we have 20 long-term experiments in the United States. And so the drives people, and so the drives stand for diverse rotations improve valuable ecosystems services. And I'm glad that there's an acronym for that.
Right. Yes.
So
It's very
these QR codes take us to the drive site, and also the one QR code, the one closer to the top, is the actual paper that was just published on diverse rotations. And so
okay.
this paper had a number of really good results that applied to a number of different long-term rotations across North America, 22 long-term experiments, and a lot of trends were seen in most of these long-term experiments, different environments, different soil types, and it just underlines the importance of crop rotations, and that they're not to be messed with, or they are to be messed with in terms of crop rotation sequence and species and diversity and complexity. And it's just fascinating to get into why yields are responding with one crop or another crop in the rotation. Very complex in
Yeah.
just trying to understand that.
Mm-hmm. Complex is okay. We can
Yes.
understand hard
Yep.
things.
That's right.
So yeah, but all of our cropping systems are complicated if you really get down to it. Thank you both for joining me here on the Agronomist. This has been fascinating and fantastic. I really appreciate both of your time and your insight into this. Thank you everyone for joining us in the comments as well. Some fascinating questions and really great observations. And thank you for sharing that as well. It makes for such an engaging conversation. I really appreciate it. And I apologize to my producer for making him pull clips I didn't play. Sorry, Jay. But Dave, thank you. Lana, thank you so much for joining me here. I appreciate it very much. And
Thank you.
we'll see everyone next week right here for the Agronomist, 8 p.m. Eastern, a month till Christmas, everybody. Just remember that. Okay. All right. Have a great night. Cheers. Thanks, David.
Good
Thanks,
night.
Lana.